Stop and actually think about this for a second. You wake up in 100,000 BC. There are no books, no parents who sat you down for the talk, no biology class, no internet. How exactly do you figure out that sex causes pregnancy? You can't feel conception happening. You can't see it. The gap between cause and effect is 9 months long. Now ask yourself honestly, without everything modern civilization handed you, would you have figured it out? Because for a very long time we didn't. This is not a joke video. This is not clickbait. This is one of the most genuinely fascinating and almost completely ignored questions in the entire history of our species. When did humans first understand what sex was actually for? Not the act, the consequence. Because the act is as old as life itself. The understanding came much, much later. And the gap between those two things, the gap between doing something and understanding why you're doing it, might be one of the most important cognitive leaps our ancestors ever made. Because here's what nobody tells you. The discovery of paternity, the understanding that a specific sexual act causes a specific pregnancy 9 months later, didn't just change how humans thought about sex. It changed how we organized families. It changed how we thought about property and inheritance. It changed the structure of religion. It changed the legal status of women. It changed warfare. It reshaped the entire architecture of human civilization in ways so fundamental, so load-bearing that we are still living inside the consequences right now. All of that from one cognitive connection. Let's go. First, let's establish something important. We are not talking about animals that didn't have sex. We are absolutely not talking about that. Our ancestors were having sex continuously, enthusiastically, and by all available evidence, frequently for hundreds of thousands of years before the cognitive leap we're discussing happened. Sex is ancient. Sex is older than our species. Sex in the purely behavioral sense requires zero understanding of consequences to occur. Every animal on Earth does it. Most of them have no idea why beyond the immediate biological drive. What we are talking about is something far more specific and far more remarkable. The moment a human mind made the connection between a sexual act and a pregnancy. The moment someone thought, not just felt, but actually thought, that thing we did 9 months ago caused this. And here's why that connection is genuinely hard to make. Think about it from a pure information perspective. You are a human living in 100,000 BC. You observe sex happening constantly. You observe pregnancies happening. But between those two events is a 9-month gap filled with everything else that happens in a human life. Hunting, migration, illness, other sexual encounters, seasons changing, people dying, babies being born. The signal is buried in an enormous amount of noise. Identifying cause and effect across a 9-month delay, in a world without calendars, without writing, without any external record-keeping system whatsoever, is a genuinely non-trivial cognitive task. It required pattern recognition operating across a time frame that stretched the limits of what early human memory and reasoning could reliably manage. And the argument that this connection wasn't immediately obvious isn't a fringe theory. It's a position taken seriously by anthropologists, evolutionary biologists, and researchers in human cognitive development. The question isn't whether it's possible that early humans didn't know. The question is when exactly they figured it out. Here's the uncomfortable truth about this particular question. We cannot dig up understanding. We cannot carbon date a cognitive shift. We cannot find a 50,000-year-old artifact that says, in whatever proto-language existed at the time, we figured it out. The nature of this question means the evidence is always indirect. It lives in the structure of ancient societies, in the mythology ancient people created, in the way they organized kinship, family, and inheritance. And when you start looking at those things carefully, a picture emerges that is genuinely startling. Let's start with kinship systems. In the earliest recoverable human social structures, and in the indigenous cultures that anthropologists studied before those cultures were changed by contact with the modern world, a pattern appears repeatedly. Matrilineal kinship. Descent and inheritance traced through the mother, not the father. In a matrilineal system, a child belongs to the mother's family. Property passes through the mother's line. The important male figure in a child's life is not the biological father, but the mother's brother, the maternal uncle. Now, why would this system exist? Why would so many early human societies independently arrive at a structure where the father played a peripheral social role? The most compelling explanation, advanced by multiple researchers across the 20th century, is straightforward. In a world where paternity was not understood, maternity was the only parentage you could be certain of. You always know who the mother is. You can see her. You watched the birth happen. The identity of the biological father requires an understanding of conception that, for a significant portion of human prehistory, may simply not have existed. The mother's brother becomes the important male figure because he is the male whose genetic relationship to the child is certain. He and the child share the same mother. In a world without paternity knowledge, the maternal uncle is the closest male relative you can actually verify. The structure of early kinship systems, across cultures that had zero contact with each other, encodes in its very architecture the absence of paternity knowledge. The social structure is the evidence. Here's something that rarely comes up in the academic discussion of this topic, but absolutely deserves a moment. We've been talking about sex in terms of reproduction and cognition and social structure, but sex is also and has always been about pleasure. And the human relationship with sexual pleasure has its own fascinating prehistoric dimension that's entirely separate from the reproduction question. Human beings are one of the very few species on Earth that engage in sex outside of the female fertile window. Most animals have sex strictly during estrus, the period when conception is biologically possible. Humans have sex constantly, throughout the month, throughout the year, with no particular correlation to fertility windows in the absence of modern reproductive knowledge. We evolved to find sex pleasurable and to seek it out regardless of reproductive timing. This is biologically significant. It suggests that sexual pleasure itself served evolutionary functions beyond simple reproduction. Pair bonding, social cohesion, alliance building, stress reduction, all of the social glue functions that regular sexual intimacy between partners provides in a social species that needs strong long-term bonds to raise highly dependent offspring successfully. Our ancestors were having sex for pleasure long before they were having sex with any conscious understanding of reproduction. The pleasure came first. It was baked in, hardwired, non-negotiable. The understanding of what it could cause came later, much later, and when it arrived, it transformed something that had been purely immediate and instinctive into something loaded with consequence, meaning anxiety and power. That transformation, from instinct to understood act, is in some ways the story of human consciousness itself. The moment we started understanding what our drives actually caused, we stopped being purely animals and started being something more complicated, more burdened, and more interesting. Now let's talk about creation myths, because here's where it gets truly fascinating. Across dozens of ancient mythological systems, scholars have identified a strikingly consistent pattern. The earliest creation stories do not involve a male god creating life through any sexual act. They involve goddesses, female creative forces, life emerging from a feminine principle without any explicit male contribution. The oldest recoverable religious figurines in the archaeological record are not male. They are overwhelmingly female. The Venus figurines, carved stone and bone figures with exaggerated female reproductive features found across a geographical range spanning from Western Europe to Siberia, date back between 35,000 and 40,000 years. There are hundreds of them. The emphasis is consistent and unmistakable. Fertility, female reproductive power, life coming from women. Now, you could interpret this many ways, but one interpretation that multiple archaeologists and religious historians have proposed is this. These figurines and the belief systems they represent reflect a world in which female reproductive power was understood and celebrated, while the male role in reproduction was not yet part of the picture. Life came from women. That was the observable fact. How it got started was a mystery, and in the absence of understanding, mystery becomes the domain of the sacred, the divine, the magical. The great mother goddess traditions that appear in some of the oldest recoverable religious systems, in ancient Mesopotamia, in the pre-agricultural Near East, in early European Neolithic cultures, may not simply be artistic choices or cultural preferences. They may be the direct theological expression of a world that had not yet made the paternity connection. Goddess religions in this reading are not just spirituality. They are epistemology. They are a map of what people actually knew and didn't know about where life came from. This is where it gets uncomfortable in a direction most people don't expect. Because the transition from goddess-centered religion to God-centered religion, from a world where the divine creative principle is feminine to a world where it is masculine, tracks remarkably closely with the archaeological and anthropological evidence for when paternity knowledge began to emerge and consolidate. That is not a coincidence. That is a cognitive revolution expressing itself in theology. So when exactly did it happen? When did humans make the connection? The honest answer, as is usually the case with the most interesting questions in human prehistory, is that we don't know exactly. But we can make some genuinely informed estimates based on the convergence of multiple lines of evidence. The transition toward patrilineal kinship systems, descent traced through the father, begins to appear in the archaeological and anthropological record in a meaningful way somewhere around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. This is not a coincidence in timing. This is exactly when something else was happening. The agricultural revolution. Think about what agriculture does to the paternity question. Before agriculture, humans were mobile. They moved with seasons, with game, with resources. Property in any meaningful accumulated sense barely existed. In that world, even if you understood paternity, the practical consequences of that knowledge were limited. There wasn't much to inherit. There wasn't land that needed to be passed down. The social stakes of knowing who the father was, while not zero, were considerably lower. Agriculture changes this completely. Suddenly you have land. You have crops. You have stored food. You have animals. You have property that accumulates across generations and that requires management and succession. And the moment you have heritable property, the identity of the biological father becomes enormously consequential. Who does this land go to when I die? It should go to my children. But are they actually my children? That question, which in a mobile hunter-gatherer context was interesting but not urgent, becomes in an agricultural context a matter of survival, status, and power. And here's the thing. Farmers had something hunter-gatherers didn't. They had domesticated animals. And watching animals, watching sheep, goats, cattle breeding in controlled environments, watching the direct observable relationship between mating and offspring over multiple generations in front of you, provided exactly the kind of repeated, controlled, observable evidence that made the paternity connection not just possible, but unavoidable. You separate a ram from ewes for a season. No lambs. You reintroduce the ram. Lambs arrive approximately 5 months later. You do this enough times, you start to understand something. The male contribution to reproduction becomes observable in a way it simply wasn't in the chaotic, unpredictable context of human social life. Farming may not just have fed our ancestors, it may have taught them where babies actually come from. There is genuine scholarly debate about whether the paternity connection was made before, during, or after the agricultural revolution. Some researchers argue it was made much earlier, that by 40,000 or 50,000 years ago, humans with fully modern cognitive capabilities would have had the reasoning capacity to make the connection even without the domesticated animal shortcut. Others argue the social and practical context wasn't right to consolidate and act on that knowledge until agriculture created the stakes that made it matter. Both positions have evidence behind them. The truth is probably messier than either camp admits. Different human populations in different environments likely made and consolidated this understanding at different times through different routes, with profoundly different social consequences depending on when and how it happened. Here's the part of this story that most people never get to, because the discovery of paternity is often framed as a purely intellectual event. Humans figured something out. Good for them. Next question. What gets skipped is what happened immediately after the understanding arrived. Because it didn't arrive neutrally. It arrived with consequences. And some of those consequences were catastrophic for half the human population. In a world without paternity knowledge, female sexuality is not a problem to be managed. Women move, have relationships, have children, and the social structures of the community accommodate this without the identity of the father being a central organizing concern. The children belong to the mother and her family. Life continues. The moment paternity becomes known and consequential, particularly once heritable property is involved, female sexuality becomes something that needs to be controlled. Because if a man's property is going to pass to his biological children, he needs certainty that those children are actually his. And the only way to have that certainty is to control the sexual access other men have to the women in his family. His wife, his daughters, his sisters. You can trace a direct line from the cognitive discovery of paternity to the institution of virginity as a social value, to bride price and dowry as economic transactions around female reproductive access, to the legal concept of adultery as a property crime, because a wife producing another man's child and passing him off as the husband's was, in a property inheritance framework, a form of theft, to the veil, to seclusion, to honor culture, to the entire architecture of patriarchal control over female movement and sexuality that runs through so many ancient civilizations, and that we are, frankly, still untangling today. None of this was inevitable. None of this was biologically determined. It was a social response to a cognitive discovery, mediated through the specific economic conditions of early agricultural civilization. The discovery of paternity didn't have to produce patriarchy. But in the context in which it was made, a world of accumulating heritable property, male-dominated physical labor and warfare, and newly emerging class structures, it very largely did. That's the uncomfortable truth in the middle of this story. One of the most significant moments in the history of human cognition also set in motion a restructuring of human society whose costs were paid almost entirely by women. The same cognitive leap that gave us inheritance law, stable family structures, and a more accurate understanding of human biology also gave us millennia of female subjugation dressed up as tradition, morality, and divine order. Both things are true simultaneously. That's how history works. We are, right now, today, still living in the cognitive and social aftermath of this discovery. The entire legal, moral, and religious architecture around human sexuality in virtually every culture on Earth has its roots in the moment our ancestors connected the act to the consequence. Virginity tests, marriage contracts, inheritance law, paternity suits, reproductive rights debates, all of it, every last bit of it, traces back to that original cognitive moment. Sometime, somewhere, a human being made a connection that no human before them had ever made. And the world changed. We don't know who they were. We don't know if it was a woman watching her own pregnancies and making the calculation, or a man who spent years observing animals before the pattern became impossible to ignore, or a community of people who arrived at the understanding collectively over generations and embedded it in their stories before it ever became explicit knowledge. We don't know. We will never know. What we do know is this. For a significant portion of human existence, people lived without this knowledge. They loved, they bonded, they raised children, they built communities. They created art and ritual and meaning, all without understanding what sex was for in the reproductive sense. And in many ways, the social structures of that world reflected something different from what came after. Not necessarily better or worse, history is not a morality play, but different. Structured around certainties rather than anxieties. Around what you could see rather than what you had to control to be sure of. The discovery changed everything. And like every great human discovery, fire, agriculture, writing, it gave us something extraordinary and cost us something real in the same moment. That's the pattern. That has always been the pattern. Every leap forward in human understanding has been simultaneously a gift and a complication, a solution that generates new problems, a door that opens into a room full of other locked doors. Think about what you know without thinking about it. You know with complete certainty the basic facts of human reproduction. You have known them since you were a child. You absorbed this knowledge from a civilization that has been building and refining it for thousands of years. It is so thoroughly embedded in your understanding of the world that it requires an active effort to imagine not knowing it. And yet, somewhere in your ancestry, in a chain of humans that runs unbroken from you back to the first Homo sapiens in Africa, there was a person who did not know. A person for whom sex was an instinct, pregnancy was a mystery, and the connection between the two was not yet made. A person who looked at a newborn child and understood, in the deepest possible way, that life was something that arrived without clear explanation. Something almost miraculous. Something that came from women, which was obvious. something that came from the gods, which was the best available explanation for everything else. That person is you, separated by time and knowledge, same drives, same body, same fundamental experience of being alive, and not entirely understanding why. Just missing one piece of information that changed everything. The next time you know something so obvious it doesn't feel like knowledge, remember that every obvious thing was once an open question, and somewhere in the long human story, someone had to be the first to close it. That moment of closing, that click of connection across a 9-month gap, might be the most human thing that ever happened, because it's the moment we stopped just living our lives and started understanding them. And we haven't been able to stop since.